In this episode, we talked to, well, it wasn't we, it was just me, talked to Ian Heptinstall about reference class forecasting, when and when not to use it, but we went all over the place as usual. So just where you thought we would be. Ian is an associate professor in project management at the University of Birmingham in the UK and lead tutor of the Masters in Science in Industrial Project Management, whose students are working through project management and studying part-time by distance learning. Before moving to academia in 2019, he spent 35 years in project management, procurement, and supply chain management roles, and he has managed projects in the process industry as both project owner and a supplier. He was the supply chain director for a construction company in the UK, and after that, he spent 7 years working all over the world as a supply chain and procurement coach and trainer. Ian's interest is in capital and construction projects, with a particular passion for systems thinking and collaborative procurement. He was a great contact. We didn't have Martin and Dale today, but we didn't need them because Ian and I just got our geek on. We talked about all things interesting around reference classing, data quality. We talked about power of leadership and change and pressure and how that works in systems thinking context, as well as theory of constraint for those that have not heard about that before. But Ian comes with so much energy and wisdom that I think you'll really like this. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the pod. Hello, project people. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Project Chatter podcast. Always good to have you with us. We're going to have a bit of an intimate session this time because there's no Dale and there's no Martin. There's just my good friend Ian, and we were already chin-wagging for a good 20 minutes, Ian, weren't we, before we realised, we better press record and start talking about something useful. But it's good to have you back. How you been?
I've been great. Thanks, Val. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you. And I just, we had a bit of a chat about where you've kind of ended up. And I love the fact that you're in the space that you're in and you can do things that you love for a living, which I think hopefully that's for everybody. But for those that are passionate in projects, it's a great sign of things. And this subject matter is great too. So I always wonder how projects will improve if we don't look into the past. But I am also conscious that the past doesn't have all the answers or all the keys. And we're talking about a few things. And I might just maybe we'll start with a definition from you on reference classing, because I think we have the ability to look back and make some changes that are positive. But sometimes I think also it's the naming conventions of these things, Ian. We say things that are very complex by definition or by the way they sound, and it scares people off. A good example of that is I was talking to someone about BIM the other day, and still for the life of me, that acronym BIM is probably the worst one. I can't help but confuse clients because they're like, that sounds really difficult, Val, So I'm conscious that the language and how we translate things to people has just as much effect as it does of selling an idea. It's a very conscious step that the project team need to think about. And I say project team, the collective guys. I don't know who names these things, but but Ian, mate, it's good to see you. So you're going to jump in there, mate?
Yeah, I was, because I think that difference of language for the same concept makes it seem hard for people to move between different domains and sectors where projects are carried out. Whereas the fundamentals, projects are a team sport, and whilst the topic will be different, managing the sort of flow of information, the interaction, the creativity, overcoming obstacles is pretty similar. But if you want to move between domains, you've got to adjust your language and terminology. So as you mentioned, looking back into the past, I'm old enough to remember terminology and phrases changing over time. So I've seen the rise of the thing called BIM. But 10 years before that, in the chemical industry, I was using 3D models for design purposes, backed by parametric databases that had different fields that we would extract data from, and it would be part of the single model. But one, it wasn't a building because it was a chemical plant. BIM, the term BIM came along later. And what was interesting at that time, sort of AutoCAD was a user-friendly term, but it was fairly late to the 3D space. But then when it joined, it sort of took off, because before then it was big systems, big technology. And I think AutoCAD developed their products at the same time that hardware was coming affordable at the size that you needed to develop a 3D model on a big project. But yeah, it was interesting moving from chemicals to the building construction trade. And it was a bit like a time warp. I can remember going around a site in London, a project team, and they were showing me the tech they were using, and they were proud of it. The major difference between what I used in the 90s and what they were using in 2008 and 9 was they had colour screens, whereas mine were two-tone green, dark green and light green. And but we still had the equivalent of video conferencing, but it was a bit clunky to do. So yeah, that sort of bit about terminology, because you mentioned that reference class forecasting as well. And when you look at it, it's what good estimators have historically done. Gathering data from past projects and revising and updating norms in the face of reality. And then part of me thinks, well, when did I blink, and when did large owner organisations stop doing that? Because I suspect they did. And what sort of Fluberg and his colleagues as academics did is the places they looked, that wasn't there. And because they didn't come from a project environment, they didn't know that other domains had decades of experience doing decent estimates. They knew what to do, but where they looked, didn't. And I think it was at the time, even large public sector organisations that used to know how to self-deliver projects had what Stuart Green at Reading University talks about hollowing out of the public sector organisations. And I saw private sector doing it when I worked in the chemical industry. I can remember the days when sort of the in-house engineers and project managers were sort of put into subsidiaries, operated as independent businesses, eventually sold. People were two-bid across to main contractors. And I was talking to somebody today about the same thing, because I think the year after chemical companies did that and governments did that and rail industries did it, sort of moved people to the supply chain. 1 or 2 years later, they could still get the same people. So when they bought a project team from the contractor, they had people who had 30 years of experience thinking as a project owner. They knew about operations. They knew about maintenance. Just as an aside, we were chatting before about the need to sort of bring a complicated system online, and that is not a simple matter when you've got safety critical and control systems and electronics. That coming from the safety critical chemical industry, that wasn't a thing because it was part of how we worked. Like involving operations and maintenance staff in the project from day one. You didn't think about it because it happened, or thinking about benefits. You're employed by the owner. It was your pension you were talking about. But I think as that shifted to being outsourced, the employees of contracting companies understandably focused on their commercial interests. And over the decades, the people who had been programmed to think as an owner have retired. And then the next generation have joined the contractors, so have not had the good fortune, I think it's good fortune, that's right, to move between different departments and functions within a project owner organisation and get a very broad view of what it is to own and manage assets. And that was always the basis on which our in-house project managers came from. So bringing the team together was not difficult. I can understand if you've had a career in project management and 95% of those will be in the supply chain, construction, contractors, maybe consultants, but it will be delivering the thing you're experts at. And then it relies on sort of instinct and intuition for somebody to think systemically, knowing how to bring it together. And it's very difficult if you've come from that environment to imagine what it's like running a rail company or a manufacturing facility. And if you've not seen it, you may not naturally bring the right people in at the right time. So I do think it's got harder. That's why I'm still working at my age. It's sort of, I think my generation has left the world harder for the next generation of project managers.
It could have very well, I think, Ian. And I like your points of view. And it's interesting to me that things have got harder, because you would argue, most, if you look at the learning curve, arguably things should be getting easier, because, and I always used to say this about project management as a discipline. It was something that was, if you compared it to any other kind of profession, it's a very odd one, because it's not as such standardized, I would say, as the people would like to think. It sounds like it is. And I don't really do project management. I kind of sit in the project management sphere. I kind of do project delivery in a consulting kind of context. But if you ask my wife, Ian, she would tell you I'm a project manager, because it's the easiest thing to say to other people if they ask.
That's another bit of terminology. The word
Exactly.
means a myriad of different things to different people.
It does.
And
It does.
What I grew up seeing as a project manager is very rare today. And if anything, the reason I paint that picture as part of my teaching and social media and the like is because if you've not seen it, it's difficult to imagine a world that's not like the one you've been brought up in. And that's sort of my concern is if you're thinking about improving, then being able to imagine something you've not experienced is part of improvement. I think they talk about the counterfactual, comparing what you've got with how life could be. And that's, I think, where we, back to your original comment, Val, about learning from history. We don't want to be continuously reinventing the wheel, and people taking 30 years throughout their career to learn that, well, these project things are better if all the team members get on and we don't put obstacles in the way to collaboration, and that we find some techniques that exploit that, and we do certain things. That's so wasteful if things are continuously being forgotten.
Yeah, it's almost like this lost civilization. We sometimes in particular subjects, and just from my experience, I wonder is there any studies, Ian, on kind of when this all went? As you said, I think there is something around, and I think we're about to go through it again. With what we saw, the boomers and the next generation's taken over, and I think everyone will see this shift again in the next 10 years as the next generation kind of takes the helm. And are we going to see another repeat of Project Reset, where we've just lost another faction of information that was useful for projects, and we'll have to tell them all again about how this works? But
probably not. But I find that many of the things that I remember are in my mind or in the odd cupboard behind here, but you can't find them on Google. ChatGPT will not know about them because it doesn't come and look through my cupboards when it builds its learning database. And I find a lot of the things that are published, I think many current academics in project management suffer from that difficulty, in that what's been published is not all that was ever known, or rather what's been published on the internet and is currently digital. And hopefully that problem will get lower and lower as a few more sort of old folks like me write down and digitize some of the memories at some stage. In fact, that's one of the sort of favorite options for my PhD at the moment is capturing some of that experience from successful in-house project management organizations from 40 years ago when I started.
It's incredible. Yeah, I think Dave Snowden talked about this on one of our episodes around sense making, and he would, rather than going to the quantitative, he would go to the qualitative stories that were passed down from senior guys to the junior guys. He talked about the story of the crane, Lang O'Rourke in Australia. He talks about a few other stories, and he lays that sense making onto some type of topography map to look at areas, and he kind of says we want more of that and less of this. And he uses that to make judgments and calls and responses around the types of systems, and then he's got the Connected framework. And I thought, I'd never heard anything like that, by the way, until I had that conversation with him. And I said, why aren't we doing more of this? You know, this, as you said, Ian, capturing more of the lessons from the guys that have been out there for 20, 30, 40 years, instead of thinking that we can take a book off the shelf. It's a very similar thing to driving a car, I would say, from a competency perspective. If I take a car manual, I can understand how a car operates. But as soon as I get into the driver's seat, it's a very different situation and experience. And I'm a danger to myself and others if I think that I can drive the car just because I read a book. So I think there is something in that. And we've talked to some other people about reference class forecasting, and John Holman's probably the most prolific online that I like to follow because he's a bit of a shit stirrer, and I love that. And I think there is this cause for truth in the value that it does make sense to use some of the past. But how do we get there, Ian? Because I do struggle. I'll be honest, I do struggle with some of the young people coming through these programs at the moment. And I've had a bit of a dig at institutions before as well, because there's more money in splitting courses than there is keeping people together. So when I was young, I learned from some very old men too, Ian. They're all in their 60s. I was starting at Thales. I just left the Navy. I think I was about 24. And I used to call them the three wise men. And they're all in planning and controls kind of areas. So we had a scheduler, a master planner, and a earned value manager, which I've never heard before after that. And they did everything by paper. And they would use calculators because they didn't trust the systems. And that's how I learned, which was very frustrating for me. But in hindsight, looking back, it could have been the best training experience I had for a year and a half, working with those guys every day. And you can't replace that. No book, as you said, quite rightly, published would have given me the breadth and the Q&A that I had with these guys on a regular basis that I took for part. I could just pull Peter over and I say, hey, Peter, what's this about? And he'd be like, oh, well, this. And he knew all the answers and how it was made up. I think what the challenge I have now, Ian, is people come in with this, it's not arrogance. It's the systems and the process are set. You know, they don't have, and they seem to let the systems rule the approach rather than understanding kind of the computation behind it. Why is it doing it? Why do we have it? And I'll give you this example and I'll stop talking. I was working with one of our staff members and she was doing an S-curve for a client, in Power BI or something like this, right? And I just challenged her just so we could challenge the client on why are we doing the S-curve? Oh, they've asked us to do it. I said, what are they going to learn from it? What decisions are they going to make from it? She says, well, they can tell if they're under or over the plan, the baseline. I said, that's great. Then what? Well, I think that's it. So,
that's a whole other can of worms, because that sort of variance from a baseline or variance from a plan, as I was always taught it, variance is an indicator to have a look, but there's good and bad reasons for variance. 100%. That seems to have changed, that a variance is a bad thing. And it brings down a whole load of stuff on you. So don't show a variance. Whereas if you're curious and managing something, if I see something on a project tracking any curve, an S curve, I'm suspicious.
Exactly my point.
Real life can't work like that. But that's a different kettle of fish. Back to the old reference class forecasting lark, which I think was sort of built on an observation that I think Fluberg calls it the iron law of project management, that sort of over time, over budget, under benefits, over and over again. And sort of his research highlighted that from his data, projects rarely met all their commitments. I'm happy to take that at face value. I know some people argue with it, and even if most do, the fact all don't gives you a sort of continuous improvement opportunity to get better mindset. So I think I put that bit to one side. Let's assume we can get better. But the hypothesis that comes out of that, following Fluber's work, basically says, well, the only reasonable explanations for that gap, that actuals are worse in performance terms than our plan, is that our plan was wrong. That's basically what lies at the bottom of reference class forecasting. Our plan's wrong. Therefore, we need to change our plan in line with the performance that projects have delivered. And I think there's a number of weaknesses in the logic of that argument. And they come from a number of different directions. Now, with your chats with John Holman, I'm sure the fact that almost none of that data had sort of input parameters. There was no data on the people, the skills, the practices, the processes, the systems, everything else. So there was no way to correlate inputs with outputs, unlike the likes of independent project analysis, IPA, where John worked for a while, Ed Merrow's company, that's got decades of that experience, where they've got strong correlation between inputs and outputs. And one of their long-standing correlations is if you move to execution before you've done appropriate levels of preparation, planning, scoping, designing, then the chances of you hitting your plan are low, even if your plan's feasible. And you get a double whammy, because if you've not done enough planning and preparation, the chances are that your plan won't be feasible either. So that's one of the schools of thought that comes to a very different conclusion than Fluber, who says the plan's wrong. They're saying, no, the plan might be wrong, but one of the problems is we dive into execution far too early. And that varies from domain to domain. If I compare where I worked in the chemical industry, if I'd have taken a project for full business case authorization to execute, and I had not already spent 10% of the total sanction value, I'd be really interrogated as to how is this a credible piece of work. The part of the business I worked in, the rule of thumb was 10% of the capital value. You've got experience in the public sector. Well, how many spend anywhere near that, getting up to what would be the full business case in the public sector?
Yeah, exactly. And I think I was just on that first point you mentioned around, I think Dale and I had the same conversation about planning, or even bid to planning, Ian, if we want to go even work, we kind of set ourselves up for disaster, because these BAFO rounds of competitiveness mean that someone has to take a slight, or doesn't mean, it generally is one of the actions taken at top down, is we were going to slice something off to keep ourselves competitive. So you distort the plan before the plan even goes into kind of the planning phase or the execution phase. Then it's up to the kickoff team and the mobilization teams to take that little bit of planning time they got left, scramble something together. And I think you're right. I think we don't front load effort enough on projects. I think you're right. I'd love to see some research on this, and maybe you're looking at this, but around that whole front end, if you just extended it by whatever the period would be, and you had a little bit more time and a little bit more calm and control, and you weren't frantically trying to get to execution, I do believe you would have a lot better of an outcome. Just my experience.
Yeah, there's two main, very significant, fairly long duration bodies of research into that haven't necessarily focused on the public sector, but the IPA database started in the process industries, the chemical industries, has moved into utilities and sort of large productionist capital assets. I think they've done a few in the infrastructure sector. So that's one set of data. And as far as I'm aware, those correlations that have come out are fairly consistent across their domains. In the US, the Construction Industries Institute, aligned with the University of Texas at Austin, has similarly been looking at the similar thing, the correlation between the front end effort and not just quantity of effort, it's the things that get done. So I don't know whether you've seen in detail either the CII's PDRI processes or IPA's proprietary front end loading. That the assessment is quite detailed. It gets into the nitty gritty of the design and planning activities for the domain that you're into. So if you're in the chemical industry, it will talk about the flow sheets, the line diagrams, the level of detail, the layout drawings, whether certain drawings are in place and have been reviewed and integrated and synchronized with each other. The types of study that's been carried out on those, whether it's hazard study, operability study, safety studies, constructability studies, and all these range of activities, data sheets on X, Y, and Z. Yeah, if you haven't got them, you get certain marks, and if you have got them, you get other marks, and then it's added up, and that's your score. And I've worked way back in the day in companies where the in-house rules were you need a PDRI score of at least X, or I think PDRI goes down, actually. I can't quite remember. 0 is better than 5.
Yeah.
Anyway, you've got to go beyond a certain quality criteria to even get time of the board to approve the business case. And those were organizations that had a long history as well as saw the data and believed in it. I know the Construction Industry Institute has developed some checklists for buildings for the construction sector. So you can get those. There's a few hundred things on the checklist. Have you done this? Have you done that? And that will correlate to the likelihood that the estimate that's been developed on the back of that design, what the credibility of it is. And more important, have you done enough to start work? Now, in construction, you get the conflicting pressures of what I see as dumb commercial mechanisms, but they're very common. Of things like, well, you can only get paid if something's happening on site. How bonkers is that? No wonder people start digging holes so that
Absolutely.
some cost engineer can sign something off and somebody can get paid. Oh, I can't pay you for that because it's not on site. We had the crazy issue when I worked in construction of delivering fragile materials to site because when they were stored where they should be stored, which is off site, we couldn't get paid for them. We could only put an invoice in when they were physically on site. And a construction site is the worst place in the world to store, a building full of light fittings.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
They don't respond well to being hit with a scaffold pole or a forklift truck. So there's all sorts of silly things that we do that people in the industry know those cause problems. But what comes around? There's an edict. I've got to use these standard terms, and the standard terms are sort of written and owners are advised by, let's say, companies that employ contract policemen that administer these contracts. What a surprise. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas, so they're not going to advise commercial mechanisms that make more sense necessarily. Or I don't know. Things like that just frustrate me about why people keep doing them and expect different results. Fine, keep doing them, but stop whinging about making losses all the time and people going out of business. And it's...
Yeah. Well, it's the same cause as, do you have the right people in the room, Ian, when you make these decisions? Because it's project managers, even, and Dale and I have said this about project controls, but we're never involved in these conversations. So if you're talking about contracts, it has to be contracts or commercial or lawyers that are talking about. Now, they make decisions on behalf of the whole project, and they sign us up to something that we know.
World, yeah. They didn't in my world. And I suppose I don't know whether it's fortunate or not, but I know enough contractees to be able to talk with lawyers. And I find over my career, I've seen a growth in the functional silos and a significant reduction in the project equivalent of the general practitioner. When I started, the project manager was like the general practice GP doctor. They were still a qualified doctor, but they could do a bit of everything, and they knew how to get the best of everybody else, and they sort of synchronized, oversaw, and could do bits of the other parts. And certainly when I worked in an owner organization, it was a pretty senior role. The senior business stakeholders expected the project managers to prevent them implementing dumb ideas. They expected them to make sure everything was covered and we did the right things. And that meant being sort of flexible, because if you had a team within the business that was very capable, you let them do what they were good at. But if you had one without the experience, your job was to fill the gaps, find an expert to bring in so that the overall team was good enough. None of us have the luxury of having a team where everybody's a star player, world class performers in every position on the field. We've got the Saturday afternoon football team, the amateur team. But that doesn't mean a good team can't do well. But you sort of cover and cope with the gaps. Sometimes you have to address them, but more often than not, you help each other, and a good team can be formed. And I think there's an over-reliance on finding perfect silo members and just assuming they will self-coordinate, self-synchronize, somehow magically work together. And I think that's making projects these days more difficult to manage, because you've got functional silos, you've got very competent, capable people doing each bit, but they don't like the idea of reporting to a project manager because that's beneath them. So we've got this command and control up your functional silo, and at the level of seniority where they come together, those people are far too busy and far too remote from the project to be able to add much value. And I like the idea of a single, the buck stops here, project manager and phase manager for certain phases of a project. I think there's a lot to that. That might mean silos give some power away.
I agree. And having worked similar to yourself across different industries, that there was some favorable ways of working that you take from each one, I guess. And before I go into that, though, I had a few questions. One of them was around what's the best commercial contract mechanism you've seen on projects? Because I do struggle sometimes looking at all of these different types. And NEC isn't very popular here in Australia for whatever reason. But I'd love to know your points of view.
My default position would be the equivalent of a project alliance or an IPD contract. So I'd look to get a multi-party collaborative contract where the profit margin made by the supply members was in proportion to the overall success of the project. So there's variations on the theme. NEC is like saying, well, I want a Ford car. Yeah, but which Ford car? They're all different. And if you get the wrong one for the wrong circumstances, NEC is not a single contract form. Now, it does have an alliance form of contract, but that's different from the engineering construction contract and the option A, B, C, D, E variants on the theme. And with the sort of bolt-on modules, it can be an infinite range of things, NEC. One of the issues used to be joked about in the construction sector when the government said everybody needs an NEC contract. So everybody set up and used NEC. But they all had large so-called Z clauses in them, which meant that the little variations that made it like the previous contract that you were told not to use. So I'm using NEC, but I put all these Z clauses in to make it exactly like the one before. I don't mind whether somebody uses a model form, a standard form of contract, or actually bespoke. That's another thing I've seen when developing a contract for a collaborative project alliance type contract. Having first done one in the days where there were definitely no standard forms, because it was 25 years ago, we had to write our own. And what surprised me was how easy that was. Because I'd been conditioned working of how difficult it is to write a bespoke contract. We found it quite easy. But the way we approached it was as part of the facilitated building of the leadership team. So because we were using an alliance, it was a 3-party alliance. And so we got a small leadership team together with 1 or 2 representatives from the 3 parties involved. A couple from the client, 1 from the construction expert, and 1 from the engineering and procurement consultancy company. And that was facilitated. And as part of the team building session, we talked about objectives for the project, ideas of how to deliver it. So we developed commitments of how the project was going to run and how the supply chain was going to be paid and rewarded and how that would align. So we had some ideas of what it would be like, but we built on those principles and basically came to what you might call a heads of agreement document that was written by the project team or the project leadership team members. No contract specialists were involved and no lawyers were involved. So we evolved that in our language, and then we passed it to the sort of commercial and legal teams, representatives of the 3 participants, and said, that's the intent we want. Will you folks write it in your language, please? But do not change what it does. But we're happy for you to write it in your language, add the bits that you think are important, the so-called boilerplate, providing it doesn't undermine this. Let us know if you've got a problem. And then sort of 3 weeks later, we had a document ready to sign. A couple of years later, I was involved in facilitating, putting in place a collaborative agreement where I wasn't a participant. And in a large company, I was told to use a model form of contract that wasn't quite suited, but we could have adapted. That was a real pain. And actually, the I developed the heads of agreement in the same way, but turning it into a contractual document was really difficult because the clauses were in the wrong order, and you had to have about, in the days of paper, 15 hands and fingers to sort of link that clause with this one. I'll get on the camera and so, right, if we say that, we've got to adjust this one. As you know, if you've read many contracts, you've got to read them all because different things come up in different sections and they're not at all easy documents to read. So collaborative contract, project alliance basis, I'm actually neutral whether it's a model form or a bespoke. And even if I use a model form, I would still develop that leadership team sort of commitment between the two or three, the number of companies involved when setting it up. I would still do that and draft the contract in legalese as a second stage. I think that was a good approach to take. Not here's an 80-page template, fill it in, because most senior people would turn off and they'd pass it to the back office people and they wouldn't realise what promises they'd made to each other. And that defeats the object.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, here's a question then. I think because you're a fan of theory of constraint as well, around if we get the mechanism right, my view is if we systemize things, we standardize things. I used to do welding when I was in the Navy. We used to build these templates, these jigs or whatever we call them. So every time you were kind of setting a weld, you weren't kind of trying to remeasure, especially if you're doing a lot of them at the same time. So what is the jig of projects? When I say that, I say the challenge I see with mega projects and normal projects is just general sizes of projects. They get more complicated or complex depending on what type of projects and what elements are involved. But I would assume if the system was systemized, if the system was standardized, maybe that's a better word, it should suit scale. But I do think we also get in trouble with scaling systems, processes, approaches, methodologies. And I think most projects I've been on now are mega projects. They don't seem to have small projects anymore. Everything seems kind of consolidated, and particularly in Australia, and so we're kind of East Coast. We've just kind of gone over the hump of transport projects, and they're all kind of slowing down. Now infrastructure and health is kind of picking up, and utilities is picking up, and energy is picking up. But they have the same challenge, which is that these projects are 50, 100 billion, 20 billion, just ridiculous money. Taxpayer funded, government funded. My conscience kicks in because, we're taxpayers here as well, Ian. And I would love to know if there was some, in your 40 plus years, Ian, is there some thing that we can do in this space?
I think so, but it's a sort of slightly different approach to standardization. I think there are some projects that benefit from sort of cookie cutter components, and you either put 6 of them together or 60 of them together, but they still connect. There are some domains where that seems to make sense, but I think the broader world of project, for me, project by definition means the thing you're doing has got high variability between each one, and the volumes you get through are quite low. But I also agree that there are standard aspects. Projects are team sport. They're actually a social sport as well. So if I pick up the Cynefin, Dave Snowden language, all projects at all scale are complex. And I don't think it helps to argue about how complex they are. Because actually, even if we could measure it, how much of that complexity is inherent and how much of it is caused by how we're trying to manage it? Meaning, are we making it worse? In complex adaptive systems terms, are we moving towards the so-called edge of chaos, where this sort of semblance of manageability that you can have even in a complex environment suddenly becomes chaotic and random? The analogy before you press record, we were talking about sort of car driving, and my analogy for Cynefin's sort of ordered, complicated versus complex is cars. A car itself is complicated. It works in the same way, touch wood, on Monday as it does on Friday. Providing it's working, it's fairly predictable, but it's got lots of different bits and it's not easy. So it's complicated and ordered. Driving the car is complex. But the thing is, more of us can drive a car well than can design a car. So, I'm not a fan of this sort of, I deserve more money because what I'm managing is complex. No, we can all drive cars, but doing so involves us reacting on the hoof to emergent situations. We need real-time information, real-time feedback, and we need some simple rules of what to do. The rules of the road. There's two options. If you meet somebody coming, you either go one way or the other, but it's consistent across at least countries. Some of us have got it right. The rest of the world does it wrong, but that's a debate for a different day. But those simple rules allow an extremely sort of complex situation of independent cars going along a motorway or a highway. It's amazing how well we do. But as you know, if you overload a motorway, all of a sudden you flip from having 10,000 vehicles an hour to a traffic jam. You get these standing waves and you've only got 3 more cars on the road, but all of a sudden you can only get 10 cars an hour down it. And that's that sort of idea of the moving over the edge of chaos. You've got something that's complex, but when we're driving cars, if we leave enough space between people and we follow some of the basic rules of the road about scanning and awareness, and we know how to drive, then we can react to what's occurring unless it becomes too dense. And then the sort of, we can still react, but the speed drops. And I think the that sort of difference between complex and complicated comes into the management of projects. Because I think a lot of the conventions and methods and techniques that we use are more appropriate to managing ordered or complicated environments than they are complex. Maybe we try and over control. We don't do the equivalent of delegate the authority to the driver. That's how roads work, because you delegate an awful lot of authority to all of us. It's not controlled centrally yet. And as we've seen, the challenges of controlling everything centrally from a big computer, have not been fixed yet, with billions thrown at it. So projects are a million miles away from that degree of standardization. But I think we can sort of, learn from that delegation. But coming back to the question about standardization, it does help to have the equivalent of the rules of the road and the highway code. So that there is a standardization of signals and responsiveness. And if you want to drive safely, you keep the 2-second rule, which applies at any speed you're going at, et cetera, that those things can be standardized. So within project environments for particular domains, and I think remembering listening to your chat with Adrian Dooley a month or so ago, he mentioned the idea of checklists. And if I turn around down there and get my probably 30-year-old chemical industry project management processes and procedures out, they're all checklists. They say basically at this stage, the project manager shall prepare one of these. So it's clear who does it. Now, they don't make the decisions themselves because they're running a project team. But they pull together and make sure that all these things have been addressed. And that was linked to the sort of gates and decisions that were okay to go to the next stage. In that organization, those weren't overly bureaucratic. They didn't actually slow the project down. They were, they were helpful to the project manager not to forget important things. That's how I saw them, much more than, I've got to go in front of the Inquisition. And they were checklist and they were standard. Now, they were only difficult when you got somebody managing a project who didn't know their stuff and wouldn't make a professional judgment, and then they were bureaucratic. For most project managers in our environment, they've got enough experience and confidence, and they've got enough support from sort of bosses and mentors and guidance to say, do we need to do that? Do we need to do that? Do we need to do that? Yes, 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 no, no, no. Good. We'll do those things. And that was the sort of use of a standard, but not being handicapped by a sort of a checklist or a template. I'm a fan of templates as well, but often they're used in a crazy way. That all the template is a checklist with a space to write the answer, but the value comes from the discussion deciding what to write down. If you write rubbish, then it's no value. It's bureaucratic waste of time. So I don't know if that answers where I think the standardization might come from projects, sort of writing down what to consider, so we don't forget.
I'm ex-Navy, so we had something very similar, Ian, that I can kind of resonate with, which is the standing operating procedures, which is the same thing. But it's almost predicated on the fact that something will go wrong because systems are complicated. And the reason why it's written like that is because when things are going well, and the car analogy is perfect, Ian, Monday runs the same as Friday. Ships are very much the same. They run on very similar things. They have big engines, just maybe bigger scale and maybe more emphasis on weight and time. But
longer than 2 seconds. You'll leave more than a 2 second gap.
Exactly. But the ocean's quite big, so we're comfortable. But the challenge is, I think as well with checklists, they're great when you have time under tension. So when things are pressurized, when things get hard, when people buckle. See, for me, I think projects, if they were very easy to run, because you said it's a team sport, it's great. But then when you're going for the World Cup, pressure changes behavior, and it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to perform optimally under that type of pressure. Yes, we do have great people in projects that can deliver under any type of pressure, and they seem to be unscathed by it. But for the everyday person, or if you're new to projects, having that checklist could be very, very useful and valuable to standardize, because you may make very unusual decisions because you are under a lot of pressure. And I see a lot of leadership they challenge with this. It's managing that climate. It's also then documenting those decisions.
Yeah, let's pick up on that one about the pressure. So I think the idea of checklist is brilliant, but if you've got a rubbish checklist, it won't help anyone. If the checklist is suggesting you consider totally the wrong things, so that continuous improvement cycle has been broken as well. That the checklist I used were in the same company that had built capital assets for decades, and they were continuously. I always looked at them because there was always something new on them, on the basis of experience. Large owner organisations, I don't see that happening. The value of capturing the experience in that way. So at best, you're reliant on general purpose frameworks like Praxis or the various body of knowledges. And I think they're too generic to be useful, some of them. So what was the other question? So there was pressure. Yeah. I've always thought the challenge of doing a project is plenty of pressure to get people excited and motivated. But why the hell do we double and treble it by using dumb practices dumb contracting and procurement and reward mechanisms, and to some extent, inappropriate project control techniques. So if I've got a very simple, a slightly different simple model about what it means to do efficient execution of a project. And I think if you've got a team that behaves collaboratively, that gets on and works well together as a team with different areas of expertise and isn't overly siloed. So I think you've got behavioral aspects of collaboration. I think you've also got the contracting and procurement aspects of collaboration, that you've not got any commercial obstacles to getting people to behave that way. Because most people like to get on and work together and collaborate. But if you're rewarding them differently, if that collaboration risks making my employer make a loss and I lose my job, then that puts people under a bind. And many of the contracting mechanisms do that. As you say, somebody sliced too much margin off. And then the big boss says, yeah, you're accountable for that job. Oh, and by the way, you've not got enough budget to deliver it properly. But if you want to keep your job and keep food on the table to feed the kids, then you're going to have to find a way to do it. So behaviorally, you want to get on with the client and the other contractors and everybody else, but you've somehow got to find some money. Now, and that's a very difficult challenge. But if you can align those, that's why I'm a fan of collaborative contracting, because it removes the biggest barriers to the team collaborating across these functional and organizational boundaries. I think the third element is if you can also bring in some methods and techniques that exploit that collaboration. And you've mentioned I'm quite involved with theory of constraints and TOC methods, one of which in the project domain is critical chain. So if I had that environment, that's ideal to use and exploit critical chain scheduling and execution management. But that's another hurdle to overcome. So collaborative contracting has resistance very often from vested interests who get paid for administering the status quo. And then I come along and said, P6, nah, you don't want to use that. Doesn't have a critical chain module. You don't want to pay whatever it is, 20 grand a year for for Oracle's earned value module. Do they still charge more for earned value in Primavera? I don't know. They did a few years ago. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
That's why I asked. It was an optional extra for execution management. Now save that money. Do it a different way. Again, there's resistance. There's not many people with the habits and the experience. People feel uncomfortable. Will I be hung out to dry if I can't drive this new system? But it requires collaboration. One of the projects one of our students did a couple of years ago, and just for those who don't know, the masters I teach on is part-time. So all our students are working full-time in project environments. They're managing projects or they're earlier in their career. So one of the guys working for a pharmaceutical company learned about this critical chain thing. It seemed to fit with pressures they were having in their work environment. We had some interviews with large companies that said, we'd used it, it helped us deliver projects well. And he said, let's give it a go. So he persuaded his senior site team to support him, to pilot it. He got some budget to get some consultancy support to help run the pilots. And a few months later, they were underway. A couple of years later, it's their default for their part of bringing a new pharmaceutical drug to market reliably. So from that point of view, they had great success with their experiment. But when he did some research for his MSc, he started to look at how operating was for the people involved, both on the project team and the senior stakeholders on the site. And one of the things that he clearly noticed was that there was almost a symbiosis of what you might call the hard formal techniques of scheduling and control, execution control, variance management, and the behavioural aspect of getting a team working together. Because one of the shifts when using critical chain is the much more frequent performance measures are for the team doing the work. They're not for reporting to somebody else. So using the tech comes with a process that forces the team to get together and ask certain questions. And that built the teamwork and collaboration, just in part through frequency of contact. And people were saying, well, initially I thought, what will we doing all those bloody meetings? But when it was much more focused and short, and I saw the benefits of it, and I saw how it was helping me, and we started to work together and support each other, they could see the benefit. And then they could more exploit the numbers that were coming out of the hard side of the system. So it sort of mutually reinforced. And one of the bits of feedback was from one of the senior stakeholders of some of these projects, who said, well, one of the shifts he saw was that under the previous regime, which was what you might call quite conventional monthly report, S-curves, baselines, SPIs, CPIs, stuff that they read but didn't really understand. He said, what I felt then was you were presenting a fantastically evidenced reason why you were late. And the frustration to me was, why didn't I know 6 weeks ago when I could have helped you? You've got good proof of why you've not hit the target, but I'm frustrated. And that was causing him to sort of micromanage, pay too much attention to the project team. He said, one of the changes I've seen is that now you're coming to me those 6 weeks ahead. You're using critical chains performance measure, so it's the fever chart, which senior managers very quickly got used to. They had no problem learning some new language. And he said, that's fantastic, because that is telling me if I don't help you, this project will be, off the rails in 6 weeks' time. And he felt, I'm getting a much early warning. And from a sort of stressful situation before, the stress reduced. People were still doing the work, but in a more relaxed environment. It was, like many of the other case studies, but it came out that there was the hard and soft coming together. It wasn't just, we've got some buffers and some different charts in our dashboard, and all of a sudden performance will improve. No, it won't. It's actually the stuff people are doing to nip problems in the bud, to get a better early warning, to work as a team, to overcome obstacles to flow, to have a mindset that says we will stop doing the things that make us very busy but inefficient, and some of which are counter-instinctive, like only work on one thing at a time. Don't start a task unless you've got everything to finish it. Stuff like that. They're probably things that very experienced project managers learnt in their career. And the critical chain folks didn't invent any of this, but as far as I'm aware, they're one of the first to write it down and say, there's some sort of formal techniques. You've got buffers, you've got fever charts, you've got a different basis for putting your original schedule together and working out a due date, and you've got different control mechanisms. But you also got these sort of behaviors, the so-called principles of managing project work, helping project work to flow, which are much more transferable. And coming to your question about technology, you don't need tech to implement it. You can reduce the amount of open work fronts that your team is working on if you're a landscape gardener employing 15 people. Because I know, because I've spoken to that landscape gardener who made a presentation a few years ago. He works in Southern California, and he improved the flow of projects through his business through just applying some of those basic principles. Stop starting a project every time you win an order. He was starting projects on customer sites were taking 3, 4, 6 months because it's California and they're rich and they've got big houses. And that's the sort of stuff he was doing. But his team was trying to keep 3 projects ticking along, just doing enough so that the client was happy, just like having building traders in the UK. You can tell that they're actually working 3 jobs at once because some days they turn up at 11 o'clock and other days they leave at 4 and they're off to finish somebody else's job. He was doing that and actually reducing the number of open projects significantly reduced their duration. So actually, from one point of view, he wasn't using his labour efficiently because sometimes they didn't have something to do. One of the guys in the gang only had 30 hours of work to do that week. Previously, it'd have moved him for 10 hours somewhere else. But that was caused, all that movement was just keeping people busy and reducing the overall flow of work. Now, that applies at a massive scale. As you know, Simon White from BAE Systems round the corner from you. But BAE Systems are also using critical chain across much bigger new projects and have been for about 3 or 4 years now. And they're finding the same rules of managing project workflow are helping them on billion-dollar projects. They use the tech as well and the scheduling, but the same underpinning rules of don't have too many things open at once. Think about making sure you've got everything you need to finish a task before you start it. That sort of very simple planning ahead. You don't need a Gantt chart to do that. You need a checklist.
100%. And I think there is this, you said about it makes some people uncomfortable to move away from the critical path method. And, the challenge with that is it's seen as an oracle in a lot of leadership's eyes as I want to get oracle. Yeah, it absolutely is. Yeah, it is. It is exactly is. Because of the fact that you can chain all these activities together, but because we make decisions on projects, that'll never be the actual project delivery path. So it's a problematic system issue. But technology, I wanted to get you before we headed off. Technology is interesting, and I work a lot in systems, as I'm sure you do too. And I'm all for things making it easier and more connected on projects. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I am, however, a bit of a critical thinker on systems solving all people problems, and I think that's where we get into trouble, and that's where it can become dangerous because we have incompetent people with powerful tools doing stupid things, and it's a recipe for disaster.
Not even knowing they're doing stupid things.
Well, that's the worst part. Is it's not like it's done by intent.
They genuinely think they're helping.
Yeah, and it's no one else. But I do wonder about this whole AI drive and technology. Especially when we talk about reference classes and we talk about historical data, it's going to be this conversation of how do we get then the right level of data trained on the right information at the right time to provide a bit more of heuristic or of reference class process. I'm very curious about how you think about this.
Like most good answers, it depends. I don't think the overall performance of projects is being held back because we haven't got the data. There's a significant difference of opinion in what it is we should be doing, and I don't see any efforts to bring together the disparate views and to lock us all in a room and come to a conclusion. So we allow disparate views as what good practice is, what better and worse practice is. And I think that's not helping, but there's many things around that can move projects and project teams in the right direction. I'm convinced that things like project alliance, collaborative project contracting is one of those almost no-brainers. As we've just discussed, I would schedule in the critical chain way, or at least to facilitate the flow of project work during execution. Those do not need more data. However, if you're doing that to facilitate the communications and visibility across very large project teams with geographically diverse members, you need connectivity to allow data in appropriately close to real time to be used. So, projects need the right data to get projects done. That's data on the project. It's the design itself is full of data, calculations, information, coordinates, dimensions. Managing that has always been an integral part of projects. And the ability to analyze the data that's inherent within a project is probably something that is worth people working on projects getting better at. I think certainly in the design and the management of execution, the use of technology to simulate, to try things ahead of time. I think you've used the sort of standardization analogy, and you'll know from your time in the military that luckily you didn't have many wars, but you had a hell of a lot of practices of being in wars. Planning's useful, but practicing is much more useful. And like the military, hopefully have very few wars, so they have to simulate wars in order to become competent. I think projects and the use of simulation in many environments will help improve that confidence and competence. And on a large project, you'll do it on one team. So sort of simulating, how shall we manage logistics on site? Where shall we put inventories? When those become a day-to-day tool of design, I think it will help us to further improve execution, logistics, synchronization, those sorts of things. So we move away from trying to optimize, but we use good enough, representative enough models to give us some sort of practice and training and to play with options. So I think there's areas of tech there that will be useful. I'm less convinced in gathering lots of historical data about lots of projects, the performance of which we don't like, and then using that to suddenly make things better. Now I might be missing something, but what my analogy is, and I've downloaded a big chunk of data from the finishing times of people who ran the London Marathon. So I know, for example, that just over 75% of contestants who finished in under 8 hours, because if you take over 8 hours, they don't even record you. So just over 75% take more than 4 hours. You could have all the biometric, GPS, health, heart rate monitoring data you wanted to gather. and put it through a big fancy machine. But I can't imagine that quantity of data will help elite athletes move between 2 hours, 5 minutes to 2 hours, 3 minutes. They need a totally different set of data. Now, if you've got an enormous database of average performers, you need to hive off the elite ones, and the elite people will work at that. So that's my concern about project data, is if we're dissatisfied with performance, we've got loads and loads of data about projects delivered in inefficient ways. And then you add over the overlay that a lot of the data will have been fiddled. People will have tweaked numbers in order to hit performance measures or to avoid getting sacked. They'll have made genuine mistakes. And this isn't an experiment like in an elite sports centre where you've tried something dozens of times and you've got a history of knowing what to measure, knowing what not to measure. This is a project. We're a long way away from that. We know some of the things to measure, but all the historical data doesn't have the input measures for us even to find those patterns and correlations. And we already have some. Take the patterns and correlations we started off chatting that IPA and the Construction Industry Institute have got. We've had that data for 30 years. Now, what use will another load of data coming to the same conclusion make if we've not acted on what we've got?
Exactly.
About that. So we need Dale with his AI hat on to put me straight on that, but he's not here, so we call the shots.
Yeah, I think with AI, I mean, it's interesting because it's the same challenge you're having with any other system. It's shit in, shit out. So with projects, training anything, and there's companies out there, we know Nplan and others that are using, large language models to access data and insights. And I guess they would be looking for certain indicators to pull to make something work in a project environment. But I am challenged by the fact that, if most of the things that deal with complexities is tailored by projects because they have to do it on the ground, you can't call this before it happens, then it'd be very hard for AI to replace that. What I think AI could be useful for, just to kind of round that conversation out, is for the integration piece. I think there's something to be said about workflows, and I do think we can make things a lot easier by taking some of the transactional work away, and data could be cleaned a little bit more. So the integrity of data could be a little bit more autonomous. For example, I think on site we can collect site data now, without really needing people to walk the site. We can do that. We can do it by sky. We can do it by land. We can use robotics in that sense. And so the data we're going to get is going to be, let's call it uninterrupted, or at least unbiased from a perspective. Yeah.
But on that, hopefully, the data we're collecting on site is to allow us to manage the project work necessary. If that data is being gathered to manage the contracts and the payments, then you are building on the wrong contract form.
Correct.
That's my proviso on that. So long as we're focusing on the things that help the project work to flow more quickly, as opposed to sort of automating the wrong sort of payment mechanisms that are counterproductive, or sort of, as I say, with my philosophy of I'd use critical change, I think, well, if you're automating the production of an earned value S-curve and SPI and CPIs, I'm saying, well, you could make that faster.
Well, this is where Gen AI should be heading, is that we should just be feeding it some parameters, and it could, because of its speed and size and access to all the different methods, it should be able to come up with an approach for us that meets all the obligations, not just the iron triangle, but the contractual constraints, the leadership types, the personalities on the business, the pressures from the client, the environmental factors.
Yeah, that I agree with. If we're working if we're working in a project that is in a constrained and suboptimal, using an organizational method that's conventional but might not be as good as it could, then I think there's lots of opportunities for technology to help overcome some of the inherent problems. But I will still say the best thing is to throw that mechanism away rather than make it better. Sort of, there's some crude English that I probably won't use, but my analogy I was thinking earlier on today was, if we've got people running the 100 meters in a suit of armor, we can use all sorts of fancy computational fluid dynamics to improve the aerodynamics of the suits of armor, and to use titanium rather than galvanized steel. But if you want to run a fast 100 meters, just throw the suit of armor away. Don't faff polishing it and making it more streamlined. And that's what concerns me about automating the wrong thing, sort of polishing the pile of shit.
Yeah, I'm not big on that either. Actually, fundamentally, some of the challenges will come with the new generation, I think, Ian, is innately they want everything automated. Because I work with some interns, and they're fantastic because they have fresh ideas and a fresh perspective on projects. They're not tainted and critical like you and I, and Ian. You know, they're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and they have a lot of energy. But a lot of the times they skip the fundamentals and go straight to system automation. And so for me, I was always taught to show my long division, show my working out, practice on paper first was always how I was taught before. So what I mean by that is we fundamentally build the blocks first, even if it's mandrolic. Then we apply systems of improvement to that, because then we know why we're improving it and where we're improving it and how it's going to be efficient. But there is a gap in that seems to be, we just want to get to there's a bit of a rush from this younger generation, which is interesting. I think the way it's going to be deployed, and I'm just going to predict this day or love this conversation, is that we will have bots effectively in the assurance space as well, checking other bots that will be doing, let's say, the standardized workflow. Because once they have agency, it's going to be very, very different to what people think. And I mess around a lot with AI chatbots and various other different tools. And what I can tell you is that they are getting very, very good at reasoning. So, and I test them a lot. And there's guys out there like Lawrence Rowland who test them all day long, it sounds like. But I'm pretty convinced that we're going to have different bots for different things, trained in different ways to help us come up with. Because one of the things I really love when I was younger, and I don't read as much books, but there was a book. I can't remember the name of the book, but it was by Edward de Bono. It might have been Lateral Thinking, maybe, or something like that. Might not have been that one. 6 Thinking Hats. And I loved the idea of perspective and different ways of thinking about problems. And I think you could have 6 thinking hat bots, let's call them bots, and you could train them to be your alliance, let's call it, and part of your panel of decision making. But as a solopreneur, as an individual, you will have this unfathomable power and insight and guidance and advice. And I think hopefully you still get to make the final decision. I still think it should be a human who makes that final decision, though. And I think the fun part would be when they're jousting with each other as well on things like this. And, you are part of that circle, but also that data that they're kind of compiling together to make that decision on whatever the problem may be will be documented and recorded, because it all is. So it will be an interesting world. It will be interesting. But look, Ian, we've spoken for a good hour and a half. We could speak forever. I'm going to be in the UK soon, so I'll send you some dates, and I'd love to catch up for a beer or a conversation. Thanks again, Ian, for your time today. I appreciate it all. Folks, that's all we have for the podcast tonight. If you like what you hear, please listen more. Listen back to some of the episodes we mentioned today. Keep liking, keep sharing, and keep paying it forward. From Val and Ian, and no Martin or Dale tonight, it's bye for now.